Hi there, this is Llarold, and this is my in-depth Blood Death Knight guide for Season 4 of Shadowlands. Let's start with the most important thing. Blood DK is the best tank in the game right now. It deals a ton of damage, it's extremely tanky, it's fun, it's good, it's great, everybody loves it, including me. It's great in Raid, it's great in Mythic Plus, it's just great everywhere. Honestly, the best. This video will be focused a little more on Mythic Plus because that's the type of content more people spend time doing, and it is really fun. But I will cover Raid stuff as well since there's going to be plenty of Raid content available in Season 4. I would also argue that tanking Mythic Plus in Season 3 was more fun than tanking in Sepulchre of the first ones, and hopefully Season 4 is going to be even more fun with reintroducing old dungeons and reintroducing Castle Nathria, which was a pretty great raid, and Sanctum of Domination as well, which should be fun to get back into. Also, before I finish up this intro part, like and subscribe, it's YouTube after all, and if you want to rewatch a section for more clarity or you just want to skip around, that's cool. I've divided the timeline of this video up into clearly marked chapters so you can quickly jump around as you like. So now let's cover how the classes performed throughout patch 9.2. Initially, the tier set bonuses were not so great. The 2-piece bonus, which grants you extra Dancing Rune Weapon uptime whenever you use Heart Strike during Dancing Rune Weapon, wasn't counting the Heart Strike hits from your Dancing Rune Weapon. So it basically added a maximum of maybe 6 seconds or so onto each DRW. Not great. Then Blizzard fixed that, and once you have the 4-piece, which grants you another weapon during Dancing Rune Weapon, you can maintain pretty much close to 100% uptime on DRW if you play well and have a lot of haste. Because of that change, Blood DKs immediately began to dominate, especially in Mythic Plus. During one MDI competition, now, the Tank for Echo managed 29 or 30,000 average DPS in an 11-minute plus 22 Mists of Tyr Nassif on a Blood DK. Just for comparison, he out DPS the group's rogue by like 2,000 overall DPS. After that weekend, Blizzard announced they were going to cap the amount of extra time you could get on the Dancing Rune Weapon at, I want to say, 35 to 40 seconds. This was met with a lot of really strong negative feedback, and rightly so. It would have really crippled the new Blood DK playstyle. Instead, Blizzard capped the 2 pieces stacking strength bonus at 40 stacks, down from 75. This was just enough to make Blood DK absolutely perfectly balanced. By which I mean they're still the strongest tank in the game, but not quite as overpowered as they were before. It also indicates that Blizzard is probably pretty happy with the state of the design of the class, so it's reasonable to assume that this is going to stay exactly how it is all the way through until Dragonflight. So, with that being said, let's move on to Blood DK's tier set bonuses. The 2-piece bonus makes casting Heart Strike while Dancing Rune Weapon is active give you a stacking strength buff and extra Dancing Rune Weapon uptime. The strength buff lasts for 10 seconds after your Dancing Rune Weapon falls off. This bonus counts both your Heart Strike casts and your Dancing Rune Weapon's Heart Strike casts, so you get 2 stacks in 1 second per cast without the extra Dancing Rune Weapon from your 4-piece, and 3 stacks and 1.5 seconds with the extra Dancing Rune Weapon from your 4-piece. The 4-piece makes it so that when you take damage, you have a chance equal to your parry chance to cast Heart Strike. It also summons a second Dancing Rune Weapon, which means that while Dancing Rune Weapon is active, your Heart Strikes generate an extra 5 bonus runic power on top of the 5 that they already generate during a normal, non-4-piece Dancing Rune Weapon. And they also give you 50% more of that 2-piece bonus interaction. Marrow Rend will also give you another extra 3 Bone Shield stacks, generating 9 per cast, which means that you basically won't need to refresh Bone Shield until you're almost out. This tier set has insane synergy with Crimson Rune Weapon, the Dancing Rune Weapon Legendary. The reactive Heart Strikes from the 4-piece do generate runic power and work pretty much the same as regular Heart Strikes. There's some weird little caveats, but whatever. They work with the Heartbreaker talent, although you don't really run that anymore because this tier set makes you overflow with runic power. And they even trigger the 2-piece while Dancing Rune Weapon is active. That's all great. So in the previous video, I didn't have a ton of great stuff to say about the pre-buff version of the set, and while that was right at the time, it's very wrong now. This set is insanely powerful. It adds a massive amount of stat budget, a massive amount of resource generation, and uptime to a major defensive cooldown. It totally rocks, and picking it up should be your #1 priority while gearing. In terms of where you want to equip this, helm, shoulders, chest, and pants are the ideal slots. Take it on gloves if that's what you have to do to get 4-piece, but gloves are poorly itemized. Chest is also poorly itemized, but you can get it at a higher item level than you can gloves. Head and shoulders are both haste verse, which is perfect, and pants are haste heavy, which is good enough. Ideally, you would run Rygalon gloves, which are higher item level and are haste verse. So that's sort of the ideal perfect setup, the 4 pieces of tier and Rygalon gloves. If you don't have a 285 item level tier chest available to you, then wearing tier gloves and crafting a Unity Legendary in the chest slot can be a decent move, at least until you have a higher level piece of gear to put in that chest slot than a Unity. So now let's cover Covenants. Because the focus is primarily on Mythic Plus, we'll start with Kyrian. Kyrian is absolutely the best Covenant for Blood DK in Mythic Plus, and it's not really very close. About 95% of Blood DKs doing Mythic Plus above the level of 25 are playing Kyrian, and rightly so. Now, just for doing 15s or even low 20s, you can play absolutely any Covenant, but I think Kyrian is the right choice because it adds the most value. There's not really anything that changes about the Covenant just because you're doing high-level keys. The content just hits harder, and the less optimal choices become serious liabilities instead of fun alternatives. The Kyrian ability is Shackle the Unworthy. It's a powerful single target dot on a 1-minute cooldown, and it spreads to new targets whenever you hit enemies affected with it with rune spending abilities. So, for example, Heartstrike. Final sentence, the Kyrian legendary power causes you to regenerate a rune each time you spread Shackle, and it also gives you a stacking damage buff that caps out at 20% more damage for 15 seconds. So when I had previously looked at this, I liked the idea of the bonus in AoE and didn't really like it in single target, and I just kind of couldn't manage to put all the pieces together. But having had the chance to play around with it a lot over the last few months, I've come to realize that it adds a crazy amount of damage and free runes in Mythic Plus dungeons. You can get 5 or more free runes at the start of pulls, which is absolutely insane for getting a dancing rune weapon combo rolling. Even better when combined with Mechanicos, you not only get a bunch of cooldown reduction, so that Shackle is available more often to give you runes and damage and so on, you also get a huge boost of threat on the pull, which helps fix one of Blood DK's biggest issues. Now let's also get to Necrolord, which is a more popular Covenant in raids than Kyrian, but not nearly to the same degree that Kyrian is in Mythic Plus. Kyrian, again, 95% of the time used in Mythic Plus. In raids, Necrolord, 55-60% of the time. For a lot of fights, such as Lahuvim or Anduin, I'm kind of blanking on anything in Castle Nathria, at least one Necrolord DK is required to grip packs of adds together with Abomination Limb. Necrolord DK is not generally as good as Kyrian at dealing damage both in single target and AoE, because A-Bomb Limb just isn't as good as Shackle as a damage skill, but it is still a decent cooldown even in situations where you don't need the AoE grips. The only fights where I would go out of my way to swap off of Necro in raids would be council fights that don't have any grips, like Prototype Pantheon. Even then, I would only do it if I wanted to parse, which I don't. The only other thing that comes to mind is Rygalon, which is a weird fight where the grips from Abomination Limb can pull Quasars toward the boss in phase 1 and instantly wipe the raid. That's actively harmful, being able to AoE grip in that fight. I would say the same thing about Kel'Thuzad and Sanctum of Domination, I suppose. So for those fights, either you'll want to hold Abomination Limb and use it in intermission phases, which is pretty suboptimal, or switch off of Necrolord entirely. Beyond that, I would say that Necrolord is a really strong choice for anything raid related. You'll want to use Plague Divisor Merilith as your go-to Soulbind if you're playing Necrolord for the added stat budget that you get from using Fleshcraft every 2 minutes. Let's quickly wrap up the Covenant section by going over Nightfey and Venthyr. Nightfey is kind of okay. It's not the best, but it's also not that bad either. I spent some time playing around with it before making this video just so I could have fair criticisms of it, and I actually wound up liking it a lot more than I had anticipated. Some people do mess around and make it work in high-level Mythic Plus. I actually used it in Mythic Raid this week on Rygalon and the Jailer, and because I have to do a lot of running around on the Jailer on the DK, I actually found it to be very appealing for the sort of unusual approach that I'm taking in tanking that fight. In general, I would say that I don't think that Nightfey is really a great option, more something to mess around with. It consumes a lot of runes, and unlike Kyrian, which gives you back a bunch of free runes in AoE, you're basically just at a deficit of rune generation when you're playing Nightfey, which isn't great. That's kind of unfortunate because there are a lot of really compelling components to Nightfey. You get a massive stacking strength buff out of playing with Death's Due, 20% with the Covenant Legendary. You get a lot of stacking health and mastery buff from Naya's top of the tree trait, Grove Invigoration. You get a passive 8% damage reduction on your opponent as long as you keep Death's Due down and you hit him with Heartstrike. That's very easy to maintain. It is good. Soul Shape is amazing. It just doesn't really work very well with the resource system. And obviously it doesn't give you any sort of AoE grip utility like A-Bomb Lem. Venthyr is a totally different situation. It's just not good at all anymore now. Because the tier set bonuses give you an abundance of runic power, like literally more than you can spend, Venthyr's burst runic power generation is basically completely worthless. It's weaker offensively than Kyrian in AoE, it doesn't really have any kind of cool synergy, and the Covenant Legendary power is pretty boring. I liked Venthyr conceptually at the start of the expansion just as a way to burst generate runic power, but ultimately it just kind of wound up being like a rushing Jade Wind for Blood DK on a 1-minute cooldown. Oh well. Now let's jump into Soulbinds very quickly. For Kyrian, it's Mechanicos. This is the standard setup for Mechanicos in Mythic Plus. He is by far the best Soulbind, and it is not even close. For fights and raids where you would want to switch to Kyrian, like Rygalon, you can set up your Mechanicos tree like this. It's almost the same as the previous tree, but you would sacrifice Hammer of Genesis for an extra potency conduit. I would only run this Mechanicos setup on fights where you don't have a lot of adds. In the case of Rygalon and Kel'Thuzad, there are a lot of adds that you can go out of your way to hit to proc Hammer of Genesis, so if you're willing to Blood Boil and throw Death and Decay down to kind of tap those adds on occasion and keep that amazing haste buff rolling, I would just run the normal Mythic Plus setup for them. I run the normal Mythic Plus setup for them because I forget to change it, but that's also good too. I would basically only run this specific setup for pure single target fights or council fights with 0 adds where we absolutely needed all the damage we possibly could get to kill it. For Necrolord, this is the standard setup for Plague Divisor Merilith. I would run this. If you're playing Necrolord in Keys, I would run this. If you're playing it in raids, I would run this. Merilith grants a bunch of extra stat budget as a reward for using Fleshcraft every 2 minutes, which is a good trade-off for the 3-second channel. You also get some basic, simple offensive and defensive bonuses that are tuned to be really competitive. This is a great tree. As Nightfey, it's Naya. Again, there's not really a huge reason to play Nightfey, but if you like it more than Kyrian or you just feel like screwing around, it is, fun, fine, decently competitive, but generally a weaker choice. Naya is a good Soulbind, though. And Venthyr is pretty much dead. Draven is a great Soulbind, but really, playing Venthyr DK is just a waste of time. Now that we've talked about Soulbinds and pointed out the best trees, let's quickly cover Conduits. We'll start with Blood DK's potency Conduits. Withering Plague is the best option available. with the amount of times you're going to be casting Heartstrike now, it's gonna add up to a massive amount of damage in any Mythic Plus dungeon or raid boss fight. After that, your Covenant-specific Conduit will be your second best option. They pretty much all just add damage, which is boring, but it's not bad. And in third place, surprisingly, it's an Unholy Conduit. The name of it is Eternal Hunger, and it grants added minion damage. Dancing Rune Weapon is a minion, and this bonus works with minions. It is by far the strongest option for a third potency conduit. It's not stronger than either of the other two that I just mentioned beforehand, but you should absolutely run it in raid setups. For Mythic Plus, I think you're generally better off taking a third Endurance Conduit in the Mechanicos tree and then picking up Hammer of Genesis instead. That stacking 15% haste buff is better than this one conduit. Now let's go over Blood DK's Endurance Conduits. Meat Shield adds a few extra seconds of time onto Dancing Rune Weapon, as well as a little bit of extra defensive value. It's very simple, but good, and it synergizes nicely with the tier set and with Crimson Rune Weapon. Condensed Animosphere adds a basic trickle of self-healing, but that's still good. I would say it's probably the number 2 option as far as endurance conduits are concerned. Hardened Bones makes Lichborn into a minor defensive cooldown, which is a good addition to DK's terrific defensive toolkit, but not quite worth giving up the constant defensive value of Condensed Animosphere to get entries where you have 2 endurance conduits, at least in my opinion. Reinforced Shell is the only other endurance conduit I think it's worth mentioning. It is useful in raids if you really need to maximize the value of Anti-Magic Zone, but I usually don't use it because I feel that the personal defensive sacrifice of giving up Condensed Animosphere and Hardened Bones to get it just is a little bit too big for adding a couple of extra yards and seconds onto AMZ. Now let's get to Finesse Conduits, which are pretty strong actually. Chilled Resilience shaves cooldown off of Icebound Fortitude. It's not a crazy amount. I think at 278 item level, it's like 40 something seconds, but that is really good for a finesse conduit. I don't really know why this isn't an endurance conduit, but either way, this would be the number 1 finesse conduit option. I've found the extra movement speed from Fleeting Wind to be really helpful at times, particularly during prog on Anduin in the intermission phase, where you have to run around and grip a bunch of adds all together very quickly. Having an extra boost of turbo speed at the start of your normally pretty bad movement cooldown was very helpful. Spirit Drain makes interrupting grant you runic power. In Mythic Plus or raid fights that have interrupts, this was extremely good prior to the acquisition of the tier set. But once you have the full 4-piece tier set, you will absolutely be swimming in runic power, and this bonus loses pretty much all of its value. Now let's move on to Legendaries. First off, you will want to use Haste and Versatility Missives for any Legendary you craft. Thanks to the tier set bonus, Blood basically only has one useful Legendary, Crimson Rune Weapon. You can just take that Super Strain right over to the Rune Carver and have him destroy it. It's dead. You can craft Crimson Rune Weapon in the gloves, shoulders, or belt slot. I recommend belt. Now as for where to craft your Unity, I had a whole thing here to say you want to maximize your item level and so on, but in Season 4 we've been told that Legendaries are not going to be upgrading beyond 291 item level, so now you actually want to minimize your stat budget. You want to put your 2 Legendaries in these slots at least once your gear that isn't Legendary is getting into the item level that's above 291. You're going to want to put those Legendaries into slots like belt, bracers, boots, maybe ring, and try to then leave open spots like helm and shoulders and chest that have a lot of stat budget dedicated to them for items that are higher item level than 291. So just to recap here, Haste Verse are your stats. You run Crimson Rune Weapon on your belt, Unity. I guess wherever it can fix up a bad spot, but really with the long-term goal of being either on bracers or boots. And now let's move on to talents. Blood DK basically has a standard Mythic Plus setup that you use 99% of the time, and a couple of options you can swap around for raid depending on the needs of the fight. I've put the general Mythic Plus setup on the left here, and the raid setup on the right. In the first tier, because of the tier set bonuses and the reliance on Crimson Rune Weapon and Blood Tap, Tombstone is by far the best talent in literally all situations. I can't believe it. I've been making fun of Tombstone since Legion, but it's finally really, really good. Cool. Now, if you don't have any tier set bonuses yet, not even the 2-piece, I would still run Heartbreaker. But once you pick up at least the 2-piece set bonus, I would switch to Tombstone and just keep it locked in all the way through until Dragonflight. In Tier 2, Hemostasis is still the go-to talent all the time. You don't really hit Blood Boil that often in single target under ideal conditions, but even so, the other options aren't good enough to compete. In Tier 3, I prefer Blood Tap all the time, and thanks to Tombstone, there's really no reason to ever run either of the other two options anyways. It's just the best. In Tier 4, I use Will of the Necropolis like 99% of the time, but Anti-Magic Barrier's cooldown reduction can be extremely useful for fights where you can AMS dangerous effects. Just off the top of my head, the Eye of the Jailer, if you take Anti-Magic Barrier, you can AMS your way through every single one of his lines and completely ignore that mechanic, which is nice for uptime. Whereas if you are spec'd into Will of the Necropolis, you're going to have to go and take the hook from one side of the platform to the other on every other I-beam. The same kind of goes for Sylvanas. If you spec into Anti-Magic Barrier, you will lose a little bit of like defensive lifeline at low health, but you're able to AMS her combos way more often, which in Phase 3 means she's going to put out way fewer stacks of Banshee's Bane when she's comboing on you. In Mythic Plus, I only use Grip of the Dead. The AoE slow is extremely powerful for kiting purposes. If I need to slow groups of adds and raids, I guess I will usually use it there as well, but that's pretty uncommon. Normally in raids, I run Wraithwalk to help with mobility. The primary exception, at least that I can think of, is Anduin, where I use Tightening Grasp so that I can Gorfine's Grasp adds during the Kingsmourn phases and during the intermissions. It won't be up during the intermission if you use it during the Kingsmourn phase and you're not spec'd into Tightening Grasp. Some players like to run Grip of the Dead for the downstairs, and that makes perfect sense to me. I just am a little more comfortable with the Tightening Grasp and so on. I think that's slightly more popular. You could also use Tightening Grasp on Lords of Dread if you're the only DK in the raid and you're having any sort of difficulty bringing the shadow adds in close once they're grippable. You won't ever have a use for Wraithwalk on Lords of Dread. Really, none of the talents in this row do much on that fight, so I think you can get away with any of them. Grip of the Dead is good on Rygalon, and, not bad on Kel'Thuzad either. Having AoE slows to deal with adds that are trying to move toward a boss or move toward players is nice. In the next to last tier, I prefer Voracious. I use it 100% of the time. It's stronger defensively and will give you more self-healing than Bloodworms. Bloodworms add some damage, which, that's totally fine. It sims at about a 3 to 4% DPS increase, which is actually very good for a talent. The defensive bonus it offers isn't bad in a vacuum, but for me, comparing it to a pretty substantial increase to Death Strike is, I'm not willing to make that gamble most of the time. Finally, all the options in the last tier can be useful, but I think Purgatory has been the biggest winner this season and tier by a long shot. I didn't love Purgatory prior to this tier. I still don't love it conceptually. Ultimately, I think that, having more uptime on defensive cooldowns should mean that you don't need cheat death effects at all. That being said, Purgatory is a really good defensive safety net. Because you now tend to run double haste trinkets, meaning no cheat death trinket and no on-use or passive like defensive absorption trinkets, I think Purgatory is a decent option as a talent. Red Thirst definitely declined. Having more vampiric blood uptime is always good and it can save your life, but it is a little bit less effective at preventing sort of random deaths to poor play than Purgatory is. I like Red Thirst. It's definitely still very hard to die while vampiric blood is active, but Purgatory is a little bit easier to use as a defensive safety net. Bone Storm isn't terrific. It's an okay offensive cooldown for content that isn't challenging defensively. It will help you dump out a bunch of the tons and tons and tons of runic power that you generate thanks to the 4-piece tier set bonus, and that aspect of it is nice. I never really run it in any kind of content, but for weekly 15 keys or Torghast or like doing world quests, it's a great option. Now when it comes down to Blood Death Knight's rotation, the old adage of easy to learn and difficult to master is a pretty apt description. That's really been pushed to 11 thanks to the addition of tier set bonuses, which basically give you not just one rotation, but two. So when Dancing Rune Weapon is active, you have one priority you want to follow, and when it's not active, you have a different priority you want to follow. And doing both of them well is really important for maximizing your damage output and your self-healing. Let's start by covering the rotation when Dancing Rune Weapon is up. The best way to think about the Blood DK rotation during Dancing Rune Weapon is like this. You don't ever want to waste resources or cooldowns, but you really don't want to let Dancing Rune Weapon fall off. And wasting some runic power is worth it if the alternative is letting Dancing Rune Weapon fall off. Every time you use Heartstrike, you get back 1.5 seconds of Dancing Rune Weapon uptime. If you have at least 50% buffed haste, which isn't that hard to pull off, your GCD will be 1 second, which means that for every 2 Heartstrikes, you can use 1 non-Heartstrike and still maintain Dancing Rune Weapon. So when should you use Dancing Rune Weapon? Usually whenever it's available. Technically, you want to have some runes off of cooldown before you cast it, so let's just say you finished an awesome Dancing Rune Weapon, you not only hit 40 stacks, but you managed to keep it active the entire time until its cooldown reset and then some. In that case, I would wait a few seconds to make sure that I had at least 3 runes available, basically waiting until around the time that 10-second 40% strength buff was about to fall off. Then I would recast Dancing Rune Weapon and start the cycle again. There are situations like the fight Lords of Dread to consider as well. If a boss is about to enter a transition phase where you can't attack anything, then you shouldn't use Dancing Rune Weapon. You always want to hold it until you can actually keep it rolling. Again, if you're about to finish a Mythic Plus pull and you're not desperately in need of a defensive cooldown very close to death, and it just comes up, I would just let it hang out until you're about to start your next pull. So how do you want to spend all of your GCDs during Dancing Rune Weapon? It changes a bit depending on whether you're in AoE or single target. Death Strike is always a good option to cast, especially when you're high on runic power. Blood Boil is good for picking up threat in Mythic Plus on a pull, but otherwise you mostly just want to use it often enough to maintain your Blood Plague and the Blood Plague that comes from your Dancing Rune Weapon. That's only once every 20 to 25 seconds or so. Death and Decay is only useful in AoE, and only because it causes your Heartstrike to hit 5 targets. It's amazing in AoE, but unless you're Night Fae, it's basically worthless in single target or 2-target cleave. Shackle the Unworthy is usually worth sending out on cooldown. You generally don't want to hold on to it for long. You can wait if you're at the end of a pull, just like with Dancing Rune Weapon, so that it's up for the start of the next one, or again, if you're in raid and there's a phase change that's about to occur, maybe you want to wait a second and, use it either after the phase change has occurred and you're able to attack again, or if you're being forced out of melee range by a mechanic like let's say the shoot mechanic in phase 2 of the Jailer, where you're forced out of range for Shattering Blast, and then you can come back in, wait until you're about to get back into melee range to hit him with that Shackle the Unworthy. The same is sometimes true for A-Bomb Limb, but there are plenty of spots where you need to use it at a very specific time, such as gripping adds together during the intermission phases on Lahuvim or Anduin. And finally, Blood Tap. You want to Blood Tap when you have fewer than 3 runes off cooldown, so that you're always maximizing its cooldown value. Basically, if you have 4 runes that are currently cooling down, you hit Blood Tap. Again, you'll want to be smart with that. You know, if you're walking into a spot where you're about to end a pull or you're not going to be able to attack, probably don't want to waste a rune regeneration cooldown right at that moment. Basically, this means your rotation is going to have a ton of Heart Strike casts in it while Dancing Rune Weapon is active. You're going to Heart Strike, Heart Strike, Heart Strike, Death Strike, Heart Strike, Heart Strike a lot, and you're going to Heart Strike, Blood Boil some, and Heart Strike, Death and Decay, or Tombstone, or Covenant Ability, or Marrow Rend, or whatever else a lot less. The main thing is that you will Heart Strike a lot. Also, because I didn't write this down, but it's important to say, don't let Bone Shield fall off. That should just be its own section. Let's say that it is. Don't let Bone Shield fall off. Okay, now let's quickly cover the rotation when Dancing Rune Weapon is down. It's a lot simpler, and let me just underline this real quickly just so no one is confused. If you don't have the 4-piece bonus yet, this is how you play most of the time. If you have the 2-piece, you can try to do the Dancing Rune Weapon playstyle while it's up, but your uptime will be relatively low until you have the full 4 set, so just go ahead and consider this the default pre-4-piece rotation. Now let's go over cooldown usage again. Dancing Rune Weapon is your main offensive cooldown, and we've covered that pretty thoroughly in the previous section. But Blood DK has an enormous bag of defensive cooldowns as well. The defensive toolkit is set up to handle practically every situation you can encounter as a tank, and you should be pretty liberal with them. It's probably my greatest weakness when playing DK is wanting to hang on to cooldowns just a little bit more than I need to. Vampiric Blood is usually my go-to defensive cooldown for any dangerous pulls or boss mechanics that aren't an enormous burst hit of damage. If it is a big pure hit of spell damage, Anti-Magic Shell is always the play. If it's a big hit of physical damage, Icebound Fortitude or Rune Tap are both good options as well. Icebound Fortitude is a much longer cooldown, and it should be used more to counteract the most dangerous moments in a boss fight or a Mythic Plus run. Because hitting Heartstrike is so standard, using Rune Tap has fallen off a lot. I try to hit it as little as I possibly can. It's not worthless, but the brief defensive gain is usually not worth the loss of a rune that could be spent on Heartstrike instead. One big exception to that is Rygalon. You don't need to Rune Tap every single one of his strikes, but because he multiplies all of the unmitigated damage that he deals in that fight with his strikes by 1,000%, getting 20% damage reduction on that initial strike with a Rune Tap at difficult moments throughout the fight is a pretty massive amount of damage reduction when it comes to mitigating that dot. Alright, let's keep on with cooldowns. Anti-Magic Zone is great for helping your party or raid mitigate AoE spell damage, and you should be liberal with it in situations where it's not designated for a specifically timed use. This is probably the single ability more on any class that I'm least liberal with. I really need to use AMZ more often. All DKs should use AMZ more often. Lichborn, especially with the Hardened Bones Conduit, is a pretty decent minor defensive cooldown that combines a bit of damage reduction with some self-healing value and nice fear immunity as well. And before I finish on cooldowns, let me talk about Tombstone quickly. I think this deserves its own section as well, so I'm going to just call this the Tombstone section. You'll want to use Tombstone while Dancing Rune Weapon is on cooldown, and while you have at least 5 Bone Shield charges. If using Tombstone leaves you at 1 Bone Shield charge or 0, don't panic, just Marrow Rend immediately afterwards. So generally, you want to use Dancing Rune Weapon and then immediately cast Tombstone afterwards, which can be a little awkward, because you generate a bunch of Bone Shield charges and then immediately eat them up. The ideal situation is for Tombstone to come off of cooldown with about 25 to 30 seconds of Dancing Rune Weapon cooldown time left, and in that situation, you could hit Tombstone, then immediately Dancing Rune Weapon, which is great, but not very common. There can be spots where you're deep into a pull, and Tombstone comes off of cooldown when you have only 10 seconds or so of Dancing Rune Weapon cooldown left. In those spots, I usually just wait until Dancing Rune Weapon comes off of cooldown naturally and then cast Tombstone afterwards. I want to get as much value as I can out of each of the Tombstone casts. The only exceptions are at the very end of like raid bosses where I know that I'm not going to get another Tombstone cast in. Dancing Rune Weapon's about to come up. It's like 10 seconds or so away. Sure, fine. I'll waste that extra time because I know there's only 20 seconds left in the fight anyways. Those spots are pretty rare. The only other spots that I would say are important to note are if you're taking Rygolon or Jailer or some boss who hits really hard and you need the shield to mitigate some sort of boss mechanic like Corrupted Strike or Shattering Blast more than you need to maximize your Dancing Rune Weapon uptime. Having that Tombstone shield layered with another cooldown as a big mitigation tool can be useful. You usually want to use Tombstone on cooldown, so if you're below 5 Bone Shield charges and early on in a pull, you should Marrow Rend even if it wastes some charges, so that you can Tombstone and continue the rotation as normal. And again, the point of all of this is to maintain Dancing Rune Weapon, keep Bone Shield up, and Death Strike your health back to full. That's the core of the class, no matter what else is going on with your gear or what you're doing. Those are the core principles of playing Blood DK. Bone Shield up, Dancing Rune Weapon up, Heart Striking a lot, Death Striking. If you can do all of that, you're going to be pretty good. In terms of handling pulls, getting Dancing Rune Weapon up quickly is important, because it's not just a great defensive cooldown, it's also a massive threat increase. Because of this, I want to use it quickly, but not as my absolute first spell. In Mythic Plus, I want to use Death and Decay and Blood Boil first, so I can generate some threat, and then Dancing Rune Weapon and Blood Boil again to get my Dancing Rune Weapon's Blood Boil on everybody as well, and then continue my rotation normally to maintain threat and stay alive and so on. In raids, I usually start a pull that I'm tanking by taunting and using Abomination Limb so that I am dealing damage and generating both threat and Bone Shield charges immediately. That way I can Dancing Rune Weapon, Tombstone, without going down to 0 Bone Shield charges and getting one shot by the boss. This helps maximize my uptime and damage on the pull, which is great. It helps you keep threat, which is part of your job. Then I continue the pull as normal, and A-Bomb Limb is generating plenty of Bone Shield charges so that I can just focus on using Heart Strike for the first 20 seconds of the pull or so. If you're playing Kyrian or Night Fae, in that case you're going to want to open by taunting the boss and Blood Boiling, Dancing Rune Weaponing as quickly as you can, and start by casting Heart Strike so that you can get 3 runes on cooldown. You can then proceed with either using Shackle the Unworthy if you're Kyrian, or Death's Due if you're Night Fae. I probably would do the Death's Due before the Heart Strike says Night Fae to get that Death's Due debuff rolling. That's the safe version of the opener. If you're a bit of a gambler, which I'm usually not, but in this case I am, you can open with Blood Boil, use Dancing Rune Weapon followed immediately by Tombstone before the boss has a chance to hit you, and try to very quickly get Marrow Rend cast out before they auto-attack you, then proceed into Heart Strike in the normal rotation with a big fat stack of 9 Bone Shield charges. Feels pretty good when it works. This runs the risk of getting you killed by the very first boss auto-attack. I don't actually recommend it, but if you like to live dangerously, this will help you get Tombstone on cooldown. I do it on Rygolon. Feels pretty fun. The basic stat priority for Blood Death Knight is about the same as it has been for as long as I can remember. Haste is amazing. You want as much as you can get. As I mentioned earlier, a buffed haste value of at least 50% is a good goal for your gear. You're going to need over 1200 haste rating to hit that point, and that's not really a breakpoint. You want as much haste as you can possibly get. It's just kind of a good floor to think about. Giving up item level to get more haste is worth it. I highly recommend not wearing gear that doesn't provide haste until you're at least into the 1200 plus rating range. I wouldn't give up more than 13 item level in a normal gear slot like gloves or chest or pants or whatever, but I would give up a little more on necks, rings, and trinkets. I wouldn't give up any item level at all on a weapon unless it's a jailer weapon. Okay, moving on, versatility is also extremely good. It increases your healing, decreases your damage taken, and it is your second best stat all around. Mastery and crit are both just okay. Crit's good offensively, but the least consistent defensively, and Mastery's just kind of average all around. The most important things to emphasize when gearing up are tier set bonuses, then haste, then item level, sockets, versatility, and so on. I would gem and enchant for haste. As for your rune forge, I recommend Fallen Crusader. It's absolutely the only option now. I recommend 30 stats to chest and movement speed to cloak, although some people like leech or avoidance, and those are both fine too. And finally, strength to gloves, and that's it. Hearthstone cooldown to bracers, I guess. Now, before we finish up, let's go over some of the gear that's going to be available in Season 4 that's a little bit special and talk about how to spend your dinars. Basically, this is a currency you acquire by killing bosses in raids, and you then use it to purchase items from 3 vendors standing over to the right of the Great Vault. They will sell you up to 3 items in total, then they disappear. They sell weapons and trinkets from the 3 raids, and that is it. So basically, you want to buy the best weapon and trinkets you can, and that's it. The items you buy are normal item level, which with Season 4 is 278 and 285, but with another currency you acquire by killing raid bosses, you can upgrade them to Heroic and then Mythic. As far as I understand, this is the way it'll work with gear that drops normally in normal and Heroic raids as well, but that has been hard to test on the PTR for obvious reasons. There's not a lot of demand for people to go raid test oldish content. So let's run through the important pieces of gear you want to pick up through this system. First and foremost, it's Old Warrior's Soul from Sylvanas. This was just nerfed by, I think, 10% in terms of the haste value. Doesn't matter, it's still the best blood DK trinket in the game by far. It grants almost twice as much haste as any other trinket once it stacks up. I guess after the nerf, maybe that's more like 75% more. Still, enormously more powerful than any other haste trinket. It takes 100 seconds to stack up to full and will last for 15 seconds once out of combat, so you can use it in Mythic Plus, but you will need to chain pull like a gorilla. It's absolutely a terrific trinket, and you basically will buy it, never replace it until Dragonflight. Next up is Gavel of the First Arbiter, the best weapon in the game for blood DKs. I don't have one, so I can't actually show it off, or I would have a little sequence showing off how it works, but basically it summons little spirits, you kill them, and you get a big buff. It's insanely strong. I have traded a lot of them away to warriors and DPS DKs, and maybe someday I will finally get a mythic one. Even a heroic gavel would be over 500 DPS increase in single target, even more in AoE, over my boring 278 weapon. So yeah, I highly recommend buying a jailer weapon. That's it. And finally, I think there are 3 other decent trinket options that all could compete for your attention. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis, Reactive Defensive Matrix, and Elegy of the Eternals. Shard of Anhilda's Aegis is the best defensive trinket in the game. It drops from the 9 in Sanctum of Domination. That's an early boss, and generally regarded as one of the easiest bosses in the expansion, so just killing them and looting Shard is a pretty good option. That's the one hang-up I have with actually buying this trinket outright with Dinar. It's just not that difficult to get one normally. The drop rate isn't great, but it's better than Old Warrior's Soul or Reactive Defense Matrix, at least in my experience. That being said, this is a really strong defensive bonus. It reduces a flat amount of damage from all hits, and all dot effects while it's active, and that calculation is done after all damage reduction effects are calculated. I'm surprised it never got nerfed, but since they just did a big pass of buffs and nerfs to all of the other trinkets in Shadowlands raids, and this stayed the same, I guess they just like how strong it is. I would say that I still don't think this is worth using all the time over a haste trinket. I would still run 2 haste trinkets as the standard setup, which is why I would say probably don't buy this outright, certainly like as your first trinket or first item with dinars. But I do think this is worth getting your hands on. You know, you can swap to it at any time you really need a big defensive cooldown, so for pushing Mythic Plus on fortified weeks, I think this is a good option. For raid bosses, I think Rygalon, Jailer, Sylvanas, Denathrius, and maybe even Painsmith are all great targets to use this trinket on. I'll finish by saying that I think this trinket is strong enough that I would actually recommend doing LFR to try and get it when Sanctum of Domination is the fated raid of the week. Even if you're like a Mythic raider, if you haven't gotten it on normal or heroic or Mythic, I would probably try to get it at 265 item level out of LFR. It's very good, and I think this trinket is stronger than almost any other defensive trinket you can get out of Raider Mythic Plus, even at higher item levels. It's just such a good idea to have this trinket available if you really need another big defensive cooldown. Reactive Defense Matrix is a really good combo of both shielding and damage output, and it really performs well while tanking when you have really high uptime. Bosses like Sludgefist, Rygalon, and Mythic Plus are where it shines. I think this one is probably more justifiable as a dinar purchase because it's a bit more rare and deeper into the raid, so a little bit harder to get. Elegy of Eternals is a pretty basic trinket. It gives you strength and a moderate chunk of haste. It's a good trinket, probably the weakest of this collection of the 3 in terms of overall strength, but the haste is very good for blood decay, and it doesn't require you to be tanking all the time to maximize its value like Reactive Defense Matrix, and it doesn't require you to like take big bursts of damage for it to really have a lot of value like Shard of Anhilda's Aegis. It's basically just passively really good, so would recommend. Finally, Weave of Warped Fates is a good normal cheat death trinket. It doesn't really do anything except prevent you from dying and basically full heal you, which is good. The 8-minute cooldown is pretty long, but it is an option if you really need more defensive value and you don't just have haste trinkets or, you know, Shard and Reactive Defense Matrix around. I don't think it's worth buying. In general, I think cheat death is usually a bit misused. It can be very useful for preventing raid wiping deaths when damage is high and unpredictable, so I kind of like and overvalue cheat deaths for progression rating, but I tend to think of them as a passive defensive cooldown on whatever their cooldown is. This one is 8 minutes. That's way worse to me than an active defensive cooldown that's like 90 seconds like Shard of Anhilda's Aegis, especially considering you can talent into Purgatory, which is only 4 minutes. Still, this isn't a bad option most of the time. So just to summarize, Elegy of the Eternals and Old Warrior's Soul is my standard trinket setup that I run pretty much everywhere. The only time I swap things around is if I need a big burst defensive cooldown, like I can get from Shard of Anhilda's Aegis, or if I want just a bit more steady damage reduction, maybe I would go with Reactive Defense Matrix. Now let's finish up by covering trinkets and important drops from dungeons in Season 4 of Mythic Plus. And remember, all of the Shadowlands dungeons other than Tazavesh are no longer in the rotation. So say goodbye to Blood-Spattered Scale, and hello to Mechagon Rings, Karazhan Trinkets, and Warlords of Draenor's 700 item drop pools. Codex of the First Technique from Tazavesh is still very good despite having been nerfed fairly late into Season 3. It's a passive proc that provides a pretty decent amount of flat damage reduction. Technically, it reflects it. It basically works like a much smaller Shard of Anhilda's Aegis that has way higher uptime, but no control over the procs. It's not as good defensively in a lot of situations where you have a targeted moment of damage incoming like a Shattering Blast on the Jailer or a Sylvanas combo, but it can provide a lot of steady damage reduction over the course of a fight like Rygalon that is intense and just deals a lot of damage all the time, or a Fortified Mythic Plus dungeon where again you're just kind of getting slammed all the time. In those cases, Codex is fantastic. Salia's Secret Technique from Tazavesh is another great haste trinket option. I would compare this very favorably to Elegy of the Eternals. It requires somebody else in your party to also be running haste so that you can tag them with it, but that's usually pretty common. That alone makes me not like it quite as much as Old Warrior Soul and Elegy of the Eternals, because even though it's pretty comparable to Elegy, you know, the act of having to target somebody else and use it is just like just one step of inconvenience that makes me go, no thank you. Ticking Sack of Terror is another useful trinket from Tazavesh. In general, I would say this isn't amazing for blood. You're generally going to get more value out of a standard trinket that either has strength on it or haste, but it is a decent direct damage proc trinket, and, you know, it's not bad for single target DPS. Mechagon gear is fairly simple. The main pieces of valuable gear there are the rings. Ideally, you will want a logic loop of recursion and an overclocking bit band. They both have haste, which is great, and when combined, they give you a big fat haste proc for doing a normal rotation. You do have to use 3 different skills on the same target, so you'll have to do something other than just Heart Strike, but that can be Blood Boil, Heart Strike, Death Strike, or Death or Decay, Death Strike, Heart Strike, whatever. That's all you gotta do, and then you get a big fat haste proc. That's awesome. The other somewhat notable pieces of gear from Mechagon are Log, which is a big two-handed mace that just looks like a tree, one of my favorite transmogs, and Remote Guidance Device, which is a very basic damage trinket. You press the button, it does some single target damage and a little bit of AoE damage. Not really all that special, but, you know, it's kind of funny looking. Karazhan doesn't have a huge amount of great gear either. The Choker of Barbed Rains from Ataman can provide a decent damage proc while tanking, but the stats on it are pretty poor. The Amulet of the Last Guardian is haste first, so that's ideal in terms of stats. It forms a set with the Wine-Stained Mantle, but that cloak is crit mastery, so it's really not worth wearing. Eye of Command is a pretty simple trinket. It will grant a lot of crit, so it's really just for DPS, but it is okay for DPS. To be honest, most of the other trinkets in here are pretty forgettable. Tony's Promise is a haste trinket with an on-use damage effect that can interact with a crit trinket with an on-use damage effect that's used by someone else. Kind of requires a little bit of coordination with other people in your group. Not the biggest fan, but a haste trinket is not bad. The Ring of Collapsing Futures is good. It just adds a free damage on use effect onto a ring, and it's pretty great until you can put together a Mechagon ring set. In terms of drops from the 2 Warlords of Draenor dungeons, Iron Docks and Grimrail Depot, their loot tables are absolutely gargantuan, just filled with tons and tons of nearly identical rings and gloves and bracers and so on that have almost all of the possible stat configurations. There's very little in the way of weapons or trinkets from these dungeons for Blood DKs, and the weapons and trinkets available to Blood DKs aren't really all that great. I would say this is good and bad. If you're just generally trying to gear up, you know, just get whatever gear you can, the Warlords dungeons have a lot of stuff to offer. In terms of trying to target farm an important piece of gear like a Tazavesh trinket or a Mechagon ring, there's just nothing special in either of these 2 dungeons to go after, and if you're trying to get like a haste versus pair of gloves out of there, you only have a 1 in 65 chance of getting that to drop, so yeah, it's a bit rough. And that's it on trinkets and important Season 4 gear. If I didn't include a piece of gear here, that's probably because it's not very good. It can still work while you try to get your hands on some of the items that are on this list, but it shouldn't be a permanent solution. As we approach the end of Shadowlands, Blood DK is literally the best tank in the game. It does everything extremely well. It's hard to kill, it does enormous amounts of damage, It has great group utility. It can immune tons of boss debuffs with AMS. It has grip. It's cool. And even better, we've seen the preview for Dragonflight, and Blizzard is keeping Abomination Limb, Crimson Rune Weapon, and the entire Dancing Rune Weapon playstyle in the game, so it's probably going to be very good and fairly similar to play in the future. Well, I think that covers it. If you have any questions about Blood DK and Shadowlands Season 4, ask away. Stay tuned for more Shadowlands and Dragonflight content, and thanks for watching. Bye.